So good afternoon everyone, and welcome to our final keynote lecture of this wonderful conference. I'm delighted and privileged to introduce Professor Michael O'Neill from Durham University, who I think Kelvin very accurately described as the greatest literary critic of Romanticism that we have now. And I'm afraid I second that with far too much vivacity. So Michael's talk today is entitled Pictures and Signs, Creative Thinking in Percy Bysshe Shelley's Prose. Now I'm sure most of you know, but Professor O'Neill's published on authors across the Romantic period and the post-Romantic period, on poets as diverse as Dante and Geoffrey Hill, and his editorship of the Cambridge History of English Poetry suggests the broadness, but also the depth of his research interests. His 2017 collection of essays, Keats in Context, with CUP, offers a full-scale reconsideration of Keats's achievements, and he's the co-author of the forthcoming Blackwell Guide to Romanticism. His publications often focus on Romantic and post-Romantic poetry, and his books Romanticism and the Self-Conscious Poem and The All-Sustaining Air, Romantic Legacies and Renewals in British, American and Irish Poetry since 1900, reflect his sustained interest in what he describes as the wish to open up possibilities and intersections between poets. Professor Michael O'Neill is an authority on the work of Percy Bysshe Shelley, and his publications on Shelley include The Human Mind's Imaginings, Conflict and Achievement in Shelley's Poetry, and of course the Oxford Handbook of Percy Bysshe Shelley. He's one of the editors of the Bodley and Shelley manuscripts and is an associate editor on the multi-volume Johns Hopkins edition of Shelley's poetry. And he's also, in his free time, co-editing the prose of Percy Bysshe Shelley, 1818 to 1822. But between all this, most importantly for my reading of Michael's work is the fact that he's an exceptional poet. He's won the Eric Gregory Award and a Chumley Award from the Society of Authors. And without any further ado, I want to introduce what I know is going to be a marvellous talk. Please join me.
Well, thank you so much, Maddie. I think that was wonderfully generous and kind of you, and I just wanted to start off by saying thank you, and perhaps we'll all join in applause for our organisers, Anna and Harry. So to my talk, which there is a handout which I hope there are enough copies of. I made about 60 copies, so you might have to share between you. And
we've got a spare.
And there's a spare here.
Okay.
I'm a bit croaky this morning, my apologies, but I hope, can you hear me at the back of the room there?
Yep.
Yeah, excellent. Excellent. Let me know if my voice dies down, as it were. I'll try not to. And I'll start with a passage from a defence of poetry, to which I'll return at the close. And in this passage, which is the first quotation there on the sheet, Shelley traces a seemingly inevitable process by which language loses its initial energy of metaphorical life. A poet, he declares, their language is vitally metaphorical, that is, it marks the before unapprehended relations of things and perpetuates their apprehension, until the words which represent them become through time signs for portions and classes of thoughts, instead of pictures of integral thoughts. And then, if no new poet should arise to create afresh the associations which have been thus disorganised, language will be dead to all the nobler purposes of human intercourse. It is for providing pictures of integral thoughts, as Shelley values vitally metaphorical language, for imaging thoughts as accessible and entire entities rather than as signs. So he's making this distinction between pictures of integral thoughts and signs. I want just to explore and tease out some of the implications of this in relation to the way he uses language. You'll see he's describing what's an almost inevitable entropic decline from pictures to signs. One of the points I want to make is that in my view he turns this supposed entropic decline to his creative advantage. And as that passage goes on, in an immediate upswing, which you can see on the passage, the nobler purposes referred to here as involved in the discovery of new relations find their advocate in Bacon, who is said to speak of the likenesses found by the poet as the same footsteps of nature impressed upon the various subjects of the world. The fear that language will grow disorganised and the need for poets to create afresh weave in and out of one another. It is because of this fear and this need that apprehension, in Ross Wilson's words, itself must be alive. Language's very frailty and inadequacy, Shelley's sense, as he puts it in one of his brief fragmentary speculations on morals and metaphysics, that our words are dead, our thoughts are cold and borrowed, or that words are the instruments of mind, but they are not mind, nor are they portions of mind, provide the tinder which ignites his prose into eloquent counteractive flame. That sense of language's inadequacies helps to explain why his prose is that of a poet, concerned like Plato to kindle a harmony in thoughts, conscious that harmony involves both a necessary awareness of the possibility of discord and a commitment to the imagination. There is a principle, he says in the defence, within the human being which acts otherwise than in the lyre and produces not melody alone but harmony. Just pausing over this word harmony, it involves responsiveness and adjustment, a thinking through the language being used with a full recognition of its constraints and possibilities, and a strong awareness that meaning is being wrought into glowing but provisional being in the act of communicating and receiving intense and impassioned conceptions respecting man and nature, Shelley's account of what poetry is towards the end of A Defence of Poetry. And his attunement, as it were, to the fact that a poet thinks in a literary way is a major reason why, and I think this has been a motif of some of the talks at this wonderful conference, why, as James Donlin had it in a recent review, Shelley has long defied attempts to create a systemic account of his thoughts in criticism. A central argument I'm wanting to make today in this talk, which draws examples from Shelley's metaphysical, his political, his religious and literary critical writings between 1816 and 1821, is that his prose, like his verse, is poetic to the degree that it builds on his belief that language, and this is something William Keach has explored very brilliantly, that language is arbitrarily produced by the imagination and has relation to thoughts alone. If one takes, for example, On Life, the second quotation there, conscripted by Earl Wasserman and many other readers of Shelley, Wasserman very brilliantly, as a solution to various philosophical conundrums, I think we might see it as working more as a prose poem, a reverie on a word, than as a philosophical mini-treatise. Though, of course, it does have great philosophical intelligence, and it does include a review of Shelley's early philosophical allegiances. Logic and rhetoric are at the service of a sense of wonder. Life, he says, this isn't on the passage, this is one of these helpful handouts where you draw attention to what isn't on the handout. I have so many drinks to choose from, but where's the whiskey? Sorry, life, the great miracle, says Shelley at the start, we admire not because it is so miraculous. That's one of the opening sentences. Life, the great miracle, we admire not because it is so miraculous. There, the word because mocks the quasi-causal exploration it offers. Thinking about a word, the word life, this word that fascinates Shelley, as with so many other romantics, but particularly Shelley, leads the essay to contemplate what it will call, you see this is at the end of that second quotation, what it calls that verge where words abandon us, and what wonder if we grow dizzy to look down the dark abyss of how little we know. Words mine their impulse to abandon us through an assonantal off-chime between abandon and wonder, and through a full rhyme between we grow dizzy and how little we know. And those effects suggest an acute linguistic self-awareness at the very moment that Shelley imagines words leaving us in the lurch. Throughout On Life, to be reduced to ignorance is a sort of good thing. It is to be saved from an education of error. And that error is caused by the mind's misplaced confidence in structures that it imposes on itself through the misuse of words and signs, the instruments of its own creation. In its place, Shelley works to persuade himself persuade himself and us of an idealism which he sees as creating a vacancy, to be filled with imaginings that take their life and newness from two counter-pulling views, as Wasserman pointed out, the view that nothing exists but as it is perceived, and the counter-view that mind cannot create, it can only perceive. The essay achieves its own creativity, its own way of thinking through language, through its continual assault on common understanding, including the use of words to suspend or create doubt about the meanings we normally associate with them. And this passage, this when I'll finally get round to reading, allows us to see how Shelley manages this kind of assault and suspension. Pursuing the same thread of reasoning, the existence of distinct individual minds, similar to that which is employed in our questioning its own nature, is likewise found to be a delusion. The words I, you, they are not signs of any actual difference subsisting between the assemblage of thoughts thus indicated, but are merely marks employed to denote the different modifications of the one mind. Let it not be supposed that this doctrine conducts the monstrous presumption that I, the person who now write and think, am that one mind. I am but a portion of it. It goes on. The words I and you and they are grammatical devices invented simply for arrangement and totally devoid of the intense and exclusive sense usually attributed to them. It is difficult to find terms adequate to express so subtle a conception as that to which the intellectual philosophy has conducted us, writes Shelley then. Pursuing the same thread of reasoning, questioning its own nature, thought is an active process, ongoing, living by and in the present participles that it generates. Shelley uses the fiction of his own individuality to propose, through a style that questions the validity of grammatical devices, the truth of the one mind. Here, we're in a very tricky space here. One thing I think Shelley uses very cleverly is the fact that language is a common possession, it's a common property rather than the possession of an individual. It cleverly supports his argument. An argument that takes him with poetic rigour into a place where he contends that the existence of distinct individual minds, similar to that which is employed in now questioning its own nature, is found to be a delusion. Writing becomes a discovery of the truth of one's own phantasmal absence, when presence is the dubious or delusory gift of the popular philosophy. Yet writing, relying on and displaying what Jonathan Culler calls in his book Theory of the Lyric, and I find this a very fascinating idea, very relevant to lyric in the Romantic period and to the performativity of Romantic poetry, where so much depends on, not red wheelbarrows laden with rainwater, but so much depends on the way in which the writer draws attention to the fact they're writing now, as in the Byron lines, just to create and live, a being more intense that we endow the form our fancy, gaining as we give the life we image, even as I do now. And Jonathan Culler talks about writing as having the power of its own evocativeness. And it's in this way that Shelley finds through writing the locus of a new freedom. If you look at that passage again, you'll see there's a rather urbane rider. The relations of things remains unchanged. The relations of things remain unchanged by whatever system. By the word things is to be understood any object of thought, that is, any thought upon which any other thought is employed with an apprehension of distinction. This is the sort of stuff I think that had everybody's heads reeling and still does. Language, here Shelley is playing with words for a serious purpose, to free the mind from its own constructions. Language, Shelley's words persuade us, is both a veil and a pointer to what lies beyond the veil. When Wasserman comes to this passage, he says, there is a veil between existence and seeming. And although we cannot construct philosophically for ourselves the undifferentiated unity that is the nature of existence, we cannot avoid the fact that we live an illusion and cannot experience existence directly. Now, I would say that that gloss by Wasserman suggests the dismay of the virtuous philosopher. What delights the chameleonic prose poet is a conceptual restlessness that dizzies the mind gazing into the abyss. So what I suppose I want us to do is not use the prose so much as I wonder what system of thought we can gather from this, what are Shelley's essential tenets, but to live with the words, to see the process of the mind at work, to see the way he uses language, the way he delights in the possibilities, the creative possibilities of language. And I do think when one approaches it in that way, one discovers a a really rather remarkable prose poet, is I suppose, my essential claim. I'm going to have another little sip of something, and I want to go now to sort of polemical prose. I suppose we'll be looking at some metaphysical prose, so I'll just have a little sip of this, and then we can go on to the address to the people on the death of the Princess Charlotte, which is the bottom there. Shelley's prose thinks through its style in multiple ways. As in the cunning rhetoric of this essay, this is a remarkable piece of polemical prose, an address to the people on the death of Princess Charlotte. This is an essay that thinks elusively and by indirection. It opens by referring to the death of the Princess Charlotte in childbirth on the 6th of November 1817, which it will then link to the execution of the Pentridge Three, Jeremiah Brandreth, Isaac Ludlam and William Turner, hanged and drawn for treasonable utterances and actions which they had been entrapped into making and performing by a government agent provocateur going by the name of William Oliver. That's E.B. Murray's gloss. Now, I haven't got the start of the passage there in front of us, but Martin Priestman has observed that Shelley begins with an unignorable echo of Wordsworth's "A slumber did my spirit seal." You can hear it here. The Princess Charlotte is dead. She no longer moves, nor thinks, nor feels. She is as inanimate as the clay with which she is about to mingle. When we've had a morning of very delightful reflections on this sombre state, Shelley's imagination drawn very much to this kind of inanimate condition. And summoning up Wordsworth's poem, Shelley makes us wonder whether the dead princess lives on, her life spirit transfused into some new creation. Maybe that's the residual effect of alluding to a poem that refers to a thing that could not feel the touch of earthly years. From the essay's beginning, Shelley seeks to democratise and extend the reach of affective rhetoric. He paraphrases Shylock in the second of his paragraphs, as he speaks on behalf of the thousands of the poorest poor. And have they no affections? Do not their hearts beat in their bosoms, and tears gush from their eyes? Are they not human flesh and blood? Yet none weep for them, none mourn for them, none, when their coffins are carried to the grave, if indeed the parish furnaces a coffin for all, turn aside and moralise upon the sadness they have left behind. Through these sort of elusive means, what seemed initially to be a lament for a young princess, I suppose the Princess Diana of her days, turns into a virtuosic exercise in polemic. And at the end of this work, what Shelley is doing throughout an address is writing, thinking through the meanings of images and tropes and expected phrases. And this continues until the mourned-for royal figure turns out at the very end of the piece, of course, to be the spirit of liberty rather than the princess. And we have the close of the essay. And I just want to look at the workings of this famous passage, just say a few things about the way I think the prose works. I'll read it and then discuss it. Mourn then, people of England, clothe yourselves in solemn black. Let the bells be tolled. Think of mortality and change. Shroud yourselves in solitude and the gloom of sacred sorrow. Spare no symbol of universal grief. Weep, mourn, lament. Fill the great city, fill the boundless fields with lamentation and the echo of groans. A beautiful princess is dead, she who should have been the queen of her beloved nation, and whose posterity should have ruled it forever. She loved the domestic affections and cherished arts which adorn and valour which defends. She was amiable and would have become wise, but she was young, and in the flower of youth the despoiler came. Liberty is dead. Slave, I charge thee, disturb not the depth and solemnity of our grief by any meaner sorrow. That, of course, is Wordsworth. Hardly well. If one who has died who was like her that should have ruled over this land, like liberty, young, innocent and lovely, know that the power through which that one perished was God, and that it was a private grief. But man has murdered liberty. And whilst the life was ebbing from its womb, there descended on the heads and on the hearts of every human thing the sympathy of a universal blast and curse. fetters heavier than iron weigh upon us because they bind our souls. We move about in a dungeon more pestilential than damp and narrow walls because the earth is its floor and the heavens are its roof. Let us follow the corpse of British liberty slowly and reverentially to its tomb. And if some glorious phantom should appear and make its throne of broken swords and sceptres and royal crowns trampled in the dust, let us say that the spirit of liberty has arisen from its grave and left all that was gross and mortal there, and kneel down and worship it as our queen. The style is one of solemn, funereal performance, almost, I would, to my ear, verging on parody, this passage. Clothe yourselves in solemn black, let the bells be tolled, think of mortality and change. Is there not a faint, unmistakable flicker of something sardonic in spare no symbol of universal grief? In the triple run of imperatives, weep, mourn, lament. All these are actions, the prose makes one feel, which a person might play. The passage adapts and resourcefully exploits the language of, as it were, processional elegy. It is as though Shelley, and we had a wonderful talk just before on Shelley and sympathy, it's as though Shelley is casting a cold eye on the capacity of his audience to be manipulated by language. Simultaneously, he engages in exactly that, a process of manipulating his audience, as he moves towards the subversion of his climax. This is no young princess for whom sentimental dolor is being prescribed, it is an abstraction. Shelley corporealizes an abstraction as though liberty were the princess, but he works to make us grieve for an abstraction as though it had a reality even greater than a person. One of his manoeuvres is to interrupt the prose after the assertion that liberty is dead with a peremptory address. Slave, I charge thee, disturb not the depth and solemnity of our grief by any mean of sorrow. And here I want to employ a trope known as settling a score. Peter MacDonald finds in Shelley's use of the word slave an inability or a refusal to see that the word names a reality of servitude and suffering. He, in his TLS review of the Johns Hopkins edition, he claimed that Shelley just chucks this word slave about with no sense of, the people in slavery involves terrible suffering. But it seems to me in that context, the word delivers a salutary shock. There is a reality of servitude and suffering in Shelley's England, and one of its traces is subjection to the ideology of monarchy, an ideology that is at once unreal trappings and ceremony and basis for an only too real state of injustice. Those who mourn for Princess Charlotte in a particular sort of way and are indifferent to the death of liberty are enslaved to an unjust political system responsible for the suffering of thousands. Shelley's doing this rather difficult thing. It's easier perhaps to mourn for a person than it is for an idea. And we tend to think that somebody who's obsessed by ideas is indifferent to human reality. Not so at all. Shelley's task, it's a difficult one, is to bring home to his reader the recognition that Auden will embody in his sonnet 16 from In Time of War. Both that human beings, unlike an idea, can die too soon, and that ideas can be true, although men die, so that we can watch 1,000 faces made active by one lie. Auden claimed, as so many poets do who are deeply influenced by Shelley, to dislike Shelley, recasting Shelley's own Rasselas-derived formulation at the close of The Defence of Poetry. He says, it's the nonsense, the unacknowledged legislators of the world describes the secret police. This is all not the poets. But there is an affinity between these two writers in their fascination with the relationship between lived experience and ideas. We live the lives we lead because of the thoughts we think. And I think that's what the passage is bringing out. Shelley, in this passage, he's walking a very narrow tightrope. I suppose most tightropes are narrow. Walking a very difficult tightrope, where he's moving between, as it were, common feeling, which he's exploiting for his own purposes, and also hints that we risk complicity in unthinkingly dangerous over-emotionalism. Michael Scrivener is alert to this and argues that Shelley avoids a new sentimentality because the suffering he laments can be changed. It's not an indulgence in feeling, it's a kind of sense that there is something we could change if we address this matter. Going back to one of my leading terms, harmony, the harmony in thoughts is kindled in Shelley's prose. Any harmony that emerges from this work derives from calculated dissonances. So the glorious phantom, where Shelley appears to be playing on, mocking and revising the idea of the glorious revolution, will make its throne of broken swords and sceptres and royal crowns. Shelley employing here a tactic of redirected suggestion. The anti-monarchical figure of liberty cannot, for Shelley, be imagined but through the language of what liberty opposes, thrones, royal crowns, and so forth. Stephen Jones makes the point that Shelley uses the devices of accelerating syntax, vivid imagery, and linguistic substitution as one thing replaces another in rapid succession. Liberty replaces the future queen, a spirit replaces a corpse, a vital idea replaces a moribund institution, the crown. That's Stephen Jones in a very fine essay in the Oxford Handbook of Shelley. Yet, these replacements are ghosted by the problems as well as the opportunities of opportunist rhetoric, let us say, and the felt need to use the language of the enemy, kneel down and worship it. Mm-hmm. These are complex problems that Shelley's prose, I think, is very alert to. So there's a section on Shelley and, as it were, political polemic. And I now want to move on to his broader thinking about, in a philosophical review, about, again, where he's thinking about the meaning of words as he is inviting us to reconsider the world in which we live. This is the passage, I won't read anything out of all of it, at the top of the first page. And the issue, well, let me lead up to it. So, one thing I think that one finds in Shelley's prose is the way that itself, it's to use that word at the end of the previous an address, the way in which it's Shelley's language is broken, it redeploys or breaks the other side's weapons, it's embattled, it's conflict aware, it's sometimes conflicted. It retains it's very reflexive, almost sardonically so, in its deployment of a kind of republican sublimity or utopian futurity. Part of Shelley is always battling with what he takes to be illusory or self-deceiving modes of thinking embodied in the language of politics. His deliberated but explosive assault in this marvellous prose work, A Philosophical View of Reform, on the aristocracy of attorneys and excisemen and directors and government pensioners, usurers, stock jobbers, country bankers with their dependents and descendants, is part of a wider, deeper consideration, one in which the reader may discern covert self-involvement of why an aristocracy exists at all. He's very interested in this word aristocracy. Why do we have it? And in thinking about the word, he takes a haughtily detached view, and somewhere in the midst of this, I think you should be able to find this. Yes, it's about the third sentence down. Mankind, you might see it there, mankind seems to acquiesce as in a necessary condition of the imbecility of their own will and reason in the existence of an aristocracy. It's all because we're so stupid. And this view builds on what one might call a sort of linguistic history of the class. Since usage has consecrated a distortion of the word aristocracy from its primitive meaning, let me be allowed to employ the word aristocracy in that ordinary sense, which signifies that class of persons. I love this. This is Shelley at his wittiest, I think, who possess a right to the labour of others without dedicating to the common service any labour in return. The existence of such a class of persons, Shelley goes on, is a prodigious anomaly in the social system. And I suppose the primitive meaning that is being distorted by current practice must mean something like a kind of an elite, a cadre of the best persons, the best citizens. And one notes how Shelley harps on the word aristocracy. He repeats that phrase, the word aristocracy, twice in this passage, as though he was intent on disarming the word of its fascination. But he knows this word fascinates us. You just have to say the word aristocracy. Would you prefer to be an aristocrat? Would you prefer to think of people think of you as aristocratic or as plebeian, for example, if you had a choice. Just chuck that out, and if one had to choose between the two, and for instance, and he concedes that this word is fascinating and needs to be sort of deprived of its power. Now, Shelley has one go at it by sort of sharp mockery, where he says, for example, monarchy is only the string which ties the robber's bundle, in one of his descents into Cobbett-like, scornfully plain English. But he's conscious that there is in the word, and you can see this in the passage here somewhere, there is something in the word to exercise. This is about the last few lines of this paragraph, of this quotation. Compared with proper aristocrats, there are also these other people that you really can't bear. They're a set of pelting wretches in whose employment there's nothing to exercise, even to their distortion, the more majestic faculties of the self. These are horrible sort of middle-class people making money in all sorts of beautiful ways. But by comparison, and maybe you could see Shelley's own class prejudice, his own sense of himself as coming from the landed gentry, though at the bottom of it is all trick, there is something frank and magnificent in the chivalrous disdain of infamy connected with a gentleman. One of Elizabeth Bishop's favourite words, of course. She loves that letter by Hopkins on how the highest of all things is to be a gentleman. Better than to be a poet. She says this to Robert Lowell when he publishes poems about the divorce, and she reclaims this word. Very interesting how that word goes on playing out in our culture. There is something to which, until you see through it, through the base falsehood upon which all inequality is founded, it is difficult for the imagination to refuse its respect in the faithful and direct dealings of the substantial merchant. They're all right. But in the habits and lives of this new aristocracy, created out of an increase in the public calamities, whose existence must be determined by the determination there's nothing to disqualify or disapprobation. They eat and drink and sleep, and the intervals of these things perform the most vexatious ceremony and accompaniment, they cringe and lie. Now, Shelley ultimately feels he's making a distinction without a real difference. The combined effects of both forms of aristocracy are harmful and unfair. But through his somethings and his nothings, these words blend, though they blend as well as clash, he's engaging in a drama of thought here. He's rehearsing arguments. He's giving way in incidentals, if not in main substance, to a Burkean position. He's acknowledging that in politics, and this is really important, I think, for Shelley's grasp of the realities of politics, faculties of soul and imagination have their place. You cannot disregard them. They have to be attended to if the trick to which they and we often succumb is to be explained and exposed. In this work, and just to take a sort of, as it were, another angle of Shelley's intelligence, the way he thinks through his prose, and I think I've got this, yes, it's the next quotation there. Shelley says that, and he brings in Christ, of course, Jesus, who he admired so much as a man whose teachings he admired, even though he denied his sort of divine claim that he had a divine status. Well, I'll come to that as well, actually. He argues that equality in possessions which Jesus Christ so passionately taught is a moral rather than political truth. So it's as it were outside the purview of this work. And he goes on to say, this magnificent passage, we may and ought to advert to it as to the elementary principle, as to the goal unattainable perhaps by us, but which, as it were, we revive in our posterity to pursue. We derive tranquility and courage and grandeur of soul from contemplating an object which is because we will it, and may be because we hope and desire it, and must be if succeeding generations of the enlightened sincerely and earnestly seek it. This is a rhythm typical of Shelley's prose. One might call it, with the last stanza of Prometheus Unbound in mind, hope creating from its own wreck the thing it contemplates. The movement from the ideal that is because we will it, to one that may be because we hope and desire it, to one that must be if succeeding generations seek it, is stirring, but also alert to the dynamics of will, hope and desire. Momentarily, the far-off ideal is made to seem the only possible goal we should seek to attain. But notice the turn straight away in this prose, one of the great turns in Shelley in prose. but our present business is with the difficult and unbending realities of actual life. And when we have drawn inspiration from the great object of our hope, it becomes us with patience and resolution to apply ourselves to accommodating our theories to immediate practice. Shelley's prose audibly knuckles under here. It accommodates itself to the difficult and unbending realities of actual life, where all three adjectives earn their keep. Difficult suggests the need for realism, unbending indicates the nature of the difficulties, and actual implying a distinction between where we are and where we would like to be. The braced way, though, in which the sentence takes the strain of this realisation indicates the author's unwillingness to let go of the inspiration to be drawn from the great object of our hope. I promised you some thoughts on Jesus a few minutes ago, so I'm going to now move on to Shelley's religious prose, prose which I suppose has as its main theme the ultimate spiritual destiny of human beings, and I think you have a comparable double rhythm here. Often, this is a point that I think emerged from some brilliant papers I've heard in this great conference, often I think one has a sense of what I'm calling a double movement involving a turn or a redefinition. There's a mobile life in the process of writing that is equivalent to that living by ideas, not sort of statement of ideas, but living by ideas which Arnold praises in his praise for Burke's, for that return of Burke upon himself in Burke's Thoughts on French Affairs. You remember how in that passage Burke, who of course is notoriously antagonistic to the French Revolution, can imagine a time when the majority of the human race addresses itself to the betterment of mankind, in which to not engage in that revolutionary process would itself be would be perverse. Arnold admires that someone can sort of fight their own prejudices so much that they can rethink their position in the process of working through the prose. Now, examples, I think, occur more often perhaps than we always give Shelley credit for. And it may be one reason why, again, it's difficult to extract always an absolutely coherent position of Shelley's prose, yet at the same time there's fascination in watching the creative play of thought in his work. I've always found, I have to say, on Christianity, one of Shelley's greatest pieces of writing. Very problematic. It's very difficult when people tell you with absolute assurance that, oh, Shelley's got this religious view and it's absolutely everything is dead set, and you go to the essay on Christianity. And I just want to, maybe we could talk about this afterwards, just sort of draw attention to some passages that are interesting here. Now, this work is uncompromisingly critical of the gross imaginations of the vulgar relatively to the ruling power of the universe. And surprisingly, if one thinks of Shelley authoring a work called The Necessity of Atheism, it's interested in trying to redefine this word God, the interfused and overruling spirit of all the energy and wisdom included within the circle of existing things as one go. Now, that keeps in play various possibilities. The circle of existing things sounds a materialist note, while interfused and overruling spirit has a sort of Spinoza-type mode. It's balancing the pantheistic and spiritual. Other definitions in the work swing between what I think we in our terms would call roughly the humanist terms, and then terms that are perhaps more uneasily, for the humanist perspective, quasi-transcendental. And let me go on to look at those. The humanist perspective shines through the comment that the person who only aspires that which the divinity of his own nature shall consider to prove, he has already seen God. Now this passage, I hope I have this on the sheet, sorry. Sorry, it may not be there, so just bear with me if you will. This emphasis that the person who is responding to something in the divinity of his own nature, they've seen God, it reworks traditional usages, but it then passes into shifts and reconsiderations. We live and move and think, but we are not the creators of our own origin and existence. There is a power, this goes back to Maddie's marvellous paper on frail clouds and glory, the standards associated with the start of Council start of Leonard Sithner. There is a power by which we are surrounded, like the atmosphere in which some motionless lie is sustained, which visits with its breath our silent chords at will. We live and move and think, but we are not the creators of our own origin and existence. That begins with a complicated echo of Acts from the Gospels, of course, Acts 17:28, that acknowledges dependence on a higher power. Even if that power may be internal, it seems no accident that this different sense of God is inextricable from an account of poetic inspiration. Later, Shelley will shift into a more conceptual mode. He brings humanity and God into alignment. He asserts that the perfection of the human and the divine character is thus asserted to be the same, though that is offering supposedly a paraphrase of Jesus' teaching. We live and move and think, that's on the third page, that's the second quotation there. And that's what I've just been reading. And he goes on to say here, we die, says Jesus Christ, and when we awaken from the languor of disease, the glories and the happiness of paradise are around us. All evil and pain have ceased forever. Our happiness also corresponds with and is adapted to the nature of what is most excellent in our being. We see God and we see that he is good. How delightful a picture, even if it be not true. How magnificent and illustrious is the conception which this bold theory suggests the contemplation, even if it be no more than the imagination of some sublimest and most holy poet who, impressed with the loveliness and majesty of his own nature, is impatient, discontented with the narrow limits which this imperfect life and the dark grave have assigned forever as his melancholy portion. This passage, may not be on that sheet, I'm sorry, I can't quite remember. This passage plays the delights of hope against a sober sense of likely reality. How delightful a picture, even if it be not true. And in that passage, rather typically, and it links very much with what Alan Weinberg, I felt, was saying to us this morning about the essay on a future state, there is a doubleness of feeling that's coursing through the writing. No more than the imagination of some sublimest and most holy poet typifies the subtlety of the writing. There's beneath sadness at the sway exercised by the reality principle is a final twist that suggests that we see the matter as we see it because of narrow limits. There are narrow limits imposed upon us, but perhaps also implicitly our own perspectives have narrow limits, as is articulated as a modest creed, and yet pleasant if one considers it at the end of the sensitive plant. The reader is pulled between melancholy and a recognition of the value of the imagination of some sublimest and most holy poet. Gavin Hobbes has a very fine passage on this, again in the Oxford Handbook. Sorry, I'll be recommending this great work. But Gavin says, available now in paperback, just throwing that one out. What we can see here, says Gavin, is the poet yearning in spite of himself for something he can't quite allow himself to believe in, which in turn won't allow his disbelief sovereignty either. The text is knowingly scored through with longing and struggle. One might at that sort of moment feel that Shelley is smuggling back into his language a wish to honour what Wallace Stevens, albeit in a poem that denies transcendental aspirations, Evening Without Angels, calls the voice that is great within us. Yet the romantic poet, romantic prose poet, can pitilessly dissect workings of desire, and that's how I read the last sentence of the close of the essay on a future state, where the possibility of life after death is examined by a side of Shelley he must at least in part overcome in writing Adonais. And I want to read again this sentence which Alan analysed so brilliantly this morning. This desire to be forever as we are, sorry, it's not on the sheet, this reluctance to a violent and unexperienced change, which is common to all the animate and inanimate combinations of the universe, is indeed the secret persuasion which has given birth to the opinion of a future state. It is because of the desire to be forever as we are that we entertain the idea of what we cannot know. It is because of dislike of a violent and unexperienced change that we play Pascalian wagers in the hope of experiencing what is unimaginable when confronted by what our senses tell us. The rough draft has more material than this, all of which is crossed out. It's as though possibly Shelley realised that further investigation would destroy the rondeau, to borrow Coleridge's words in editing Frost at Midnight, it would destroy the rondeau of an essay which begins, "It has been the persuasion," it begins and ends with this tricky word persuasion, "it has been the persuasion of an immense majority of human beings in all ages and nations that we continue to live after death. That apparent termination of all the functions of sensitive and intellectual existence." Well, the word apparent, which ushers in all the functions as this annulling antithesis to all ages and nations, may undermine scepticism as much as it critiques credulity. Shelley could not be, as I say, in a sense more pitiless, more explicit about his wish to bring this question to the test of what he calls experience in fact, or to establish clearly what we understand, again, the linguistic self-awareness by the word death. Yet, the practice of careful examination of this empirical kind wars with sudden eruptions of latent feelings. This sentence: "When you can discover where the fresh colours of the faded flower abide, or the music of the broken lyre, seek life among the dead." Well, what a sentence that is. A deeply moving sentence. What a sentence. The sentence behaves as though it were describing an absurdity. But it rehearses one of the functions, one of the sort of indefeasible functions of the literary imagination. Its drive to relocate what Wordsworth calls the light that never was on sea or land. And I'll move now towards something that is actually on your sheet. And suggest that an essay like that is a sort of philosophical meditation, but it is more, I would say, a poetic investigation of the drama of mind and heart. It involves great self-awareness about the elusiveness of self-awareness. And I want to take one of my favourite passages of Shelley's prose now, and this is from Speculations on Metaphysics, and I'm going to quote from the manuscript version. I've given you the two versions there. It's tidied up by Mary Shelley in her great edition of prose in 1840 at A, and then B, the text in Shelley Ad C4. "If it were possible that a person should give a faithful history of his being from the earliest epochs of his recollection, a picture would be presented such as the world has never contemplated before. A mirror would be held up to all men in which they might behold their own recollections, and in dim perspective their shadowy hopes and fears, all that they dare not, or that daring and desiring they could not expose to the open light of day. But thought can with difficulty visit the intricate and winding chambers which it inhabits. It is like a river whose rapid and perpetual stream flows outwards, like one in dread who speeds through the recesses of some haunted pile and dares not look behind. The caverns of the mind are obscure and shadowy, or pervaded with a lustre beautifully bright indeed, but shining not beyond their portals. If it were possible to be where we have been vitally and indeed, if at the moment of our presence there we could define the results of our experience, if the passage from sensation to reflection, from a state of passive to voluntary contemplation were not so dizzying and so tumultuous, this attempt would be less difficult." Merle A. Williams helpfully defines the passage as among the moments in Shelley's prose when, in her words, philosophical registers elude him and he turns to elusive metaphorical writing. Shelley suggests that thought may inhabit these chambers but cannot visit them, and yet that is precisely what his prose often seeks to do, as here, to visit the chambers which it inhabits. If it were possible, is a phrase repeated so to evoke a yearning which is known to be unattainable. If it were possible to be where we have been vitally and indeed, he writes, where indeed recovers a full strength of meaning of that odd word, indeed, suggesting the possibility of such dwelling as a deed. The writing implies in act and vitality Shelley's desire for his prose to live through its intensity of self-perception. Replaying Sternian comic anxieties in a neo-Gothic mode, thought is forever flowing like a river whose rapid and perpetual stream flows outwards. It's like one in dread who speeds through the recesses of some haunted pile and dares not look behind, where the writing seems to absorb overtones from a simile encourages the rhyme of the ancient mariner. Here, thought is self-fearful, self-haunted, aware the caverns of the mind is obscure and shadowy, or pervaded with a lustre beautifully bright indeed, but shining not beyond their portals. And what I want to apply a Coleridgean phrase to what's going on here, where Coleridge in chapter 7 of Biographia Literaria, in that very famous passage, describes what he calls the mind's self-experience in the act of thinking, and invite us perhaps to think about the difference between a Shelleyan process of self-experience in the act of thinking and a Coleridgean one. Coleridge, well, I've got that passage from Coleridge just at the bottom of that third page. I won't read it, but you'll know it, where he draws this rather improbable metaphysical consequence from watching a small water insect on the surface of rivulets, which throws a spotted shadow fringed with prismatic colours on the southern bottom of the brook, and will have noticed how the little animal wins its way up against the stream by alternate pulses of active and passive motion, now resisting the current and now yielding to it in order to gather strength and a momentary fulcrum for further propulsion. This is no unapt emblem of the mind self-experience in the act of thinking. An absolutely superb, funny, sort of almost playful writing there, and so different from Shelley. He does enact that process of, as it were, emblem finding, and then the writing just relaxes a little bit and settles down into the metaphysical yield, as it were, of the emblem. So Coleridge is able beautifully in his prose to balance. He likes to sort of just rock back on his prose. He's able to balance his active and passive motions of the mind, which Shelley's thrown from one to the other, yet able at speed, and yet with this sort of extraordinary control to watch and to relish the way in which his own imagination is brought into play. Both these authors want to convey the process of thought, but it is about Shelley some particular commitment to the process of thinking that makes the genre of the brief essay peculiarly right for his endless startings again, his tackling of what I call the big little words, love, life, death, for example. In these essays, one finds in Anthony Howe's perceptive diagnosis, this is Tony Howe, coming together the generalising theoretical and emotively immediate casts of mind that are both strong and often complementary in Shelley. So I will now move to a few thoughts about the defence of poetry, and then I will cease to speak, that is. Style at such moments functions as a mode of thought. In the defence of poetry, Shelley rejects the idea that a poet must rely on metre or a certain system of traditional forms and harmony in language. And in one of the great sort of accounts of what prose poetry might be, he argues that the distinction between poets and prose writers is a vulgar error. He includes under the banner of poetry the writings of Plato, Cicero and Bacon, contending that Plato forbore to invent any regular plan of rhythm which would include under indeterminate forms the varied pauses of his style. And to go back to the passage with which I began, poetry is vitally metaphorical for Shelley as he responds to his friend Thomas Love Peacock's wittily provocative dismissal in the Four Ages of Poetry. You remember that Peacock says that poetry is the mental rattle that awakened the attention of intellect in the infancy of civil society. Shelley is in a way thrown on the defensive and yet comes out fighting. Peacock says, what's the value of poetry? Shelley says poetry is the source of all value. He uses an array of tropes, rhythmic devices, bewitching images to as it were, enact the significance of metaphorical thinking, dazzlingly. To go back to the passage with which we began, if we could just take that very first passage again, poetry marks the before unapprehended relations of things and perpetuates their apprehension, where the rapid dance of bunching, lengthening sound similarities duplicates the effort to perpetuate apprehension through metaphor. But the sentence goes on, mimicking in its syntactical falling away the semantic entropy it describes, to depict a deforming until the words which represent these come through time, signs, portions of past thoughts and so forth. The harmony in thoughts that Shelley seeks to create, to kindle, does not preclude shifts, collisions of perspective between, this is M.H. Abrams' terms, between two planes of thought in Shelley's aesthetics, one Platonistic and mimetic, the other psychological and expressive. applied alternatively, as it were, as Abraham's notes to each of the major topics under discussion. I suppose the Platonistic and mimetic one is suggesting that what he's saying corresponds to some reality, and the expressive and psychological one is emphasising more some sort of subjectivity of desire. And sometimes in a defence of poetry, Shelley actually foregrounds as alternating between these two frames, these two planes of thought. That's when he teases us in and out of thought. I mean, this is part of Wasserman interprets this rather differently, but it's a very interesting moment where he says, and whether poetry spreads its own figured curtain or withdraws life's dark veil from before the scene of things, it equally creates for us a being within our being. Such a fascinating sentence, that one, but very hard to show. Whether poetry spreads its own figured curtain or withdraws life's dark veil from before the scene of things, it equally creates for us a being within our being. Well, there's an astonishing difference between spreading a figured curtain, inventing, as Wallace-Stevens would call it, and on the one hand, or withdrawing life's dark veil from before the scene of things, on the other hand, discovering. It's a sort of invention versus discovering. And Shelley says it doesn't matter how you see that, because it equally creates for us a being within our being. But you see the high intelligence of thinking about poetics, the way he allows those two possibilities to coexist in the same sentence and conveyed through images that sort of are working rather fascinatingly together. We have a figured curtain or a veil, so in a sense that's almost abolishing a distinction, even as the or and the syntax is keeping the possibility of distinction in play. That or is also an and. Shelley makes us recognise in the sentence for the need for a figured curtain, a need present in the very mention of the curtain and its alternative lifestyle veil. The language has to use its own figured curtain. Yet I want to go back, there's something aristocratic about that writing too, to use Shelley's word. It's nonchalant. There's sprezzatura there. I just want to end on a note of lightness on Shelley. The way he poses that conundrum with a nonchalance that is part of its meaning. Whatever the precise nature of poetry's truth claims, it equally creates for us a being within our being. It permits us some kind of second mode of existence. Through its syntax, its imagery, of its interplay of sound and sense, Shelley's prose in A Defence and elsewhere is essentially that of a poet. It creates a fresh, its style kindling, and often complex harmony in thoughts. Thanks very much.